Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to today's special session at the Home of Harmony. Today, as our guest speaker, we have Rebekah Coffman. She is a historian, preservationist, and curator, currently serving as the curator of religion and community history at the Chicago History Museum. There, she leads the Chicago Sacred Initiative, and she's going to share more about that in today's presentation. Her interdisciplinary work is at the intersection of religious identity and the built environment and explores themes of tangible and intangible heritages through place-based, community-centered approaches. And I similarly hope that we'll learn more about that. It will be more clear as we go through the presentation. She has been a contributing curator to the Religion, Art, and Technology Lab, curating the 2021 digital exhibition, and founded the Sacred Shift Project in 2019, an ongoing research project surveying religious buildings adaptively reused by different faith traditions, which perhaps led her to her interest in our Home of Harmony. Today, the topic of her presentation is Chicago Sacred, Curating Everyday Religious Heritages. So we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A at the end of the talk, so have your questions ready. And on that note, may I invite Rebekah Coffman to begin her talk.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. Thank you so much to Swami Ishitamananda and Sravani for the very kind invitation to be speaking in this beautiful space, and to the Vivekananda Society more broadly for your very kind welcome. I did also want to give a couple of additional thanks today. One is to my colleague, Peter Alter, who's our chief historian and director of our Studs Terkel Oral History Center. So I'm pointing him out so you can go ask him questions about the work we do as well. And then I also wanted to thank David Foster and Vicki Rogers, who were attendees of this space when it was a Methodist church, and were very kind to share a little bit contextual history that will find its way into the talk today. So with that, we will begin. We will make sure I know how to use the clicker too. There we go. So today, the title of my talk is Chicago Sacred, which, as we said, is an initiative that the Chicago History Museum began. And so through this conversation, we'll talk a little bit about the initiative. We'll also talk about what it means to curate religious heritage in a public history setting. And we'll go through some examples of how we've done that at the museum, both before I began, but also in my work since I've begun in 2022, and talk about a forthcoming project we have that will relate to some architectural history and discussions around that. But the first thing I wanted to do is acknowledge when we talk about sacredness, that can mean a lot of different things to people. And for us as the institution, we started our definitions around sacredness with an understanding that Chicago as a city has held many definitions of that term, and that includes indigenous peoples. And so as an institution, we do have a land acknowledgement. I won't read it right now, but it is on the screen just as a reminder to us all of sacred communities longstanding here in the city. If you've not been to the Chicago History Museum, I just put a little picture here so you can see us. We're down in Lincoln Park, and we are the city's, we say we're the city's oldest cultural institution. We began in the 1850s, but since the early 2000s, we've functioned as the Chicago History Museum with a mission not just to have history and talk about historical things and objects, but really this part about engaging each other in history, which I think for me is the work that I really find passion in. And so, you know, a conversation like today where we're not just talking about history, but we can have discussion and we can share in this history together is really, really exciting for me. So that's a little picture of our inside, but something I wanted to share, I don't know that people always understand the scale of the museum we have. So we have 23 million objects in our collection. And I always say, as a curator, that means I couldn't in 100 lifetimes probably understand every object we have. And so as a publicly engaged history museum, it really means we rely on people in the public to connect with us about this history, to tell us about things we may not know about our collection or about the history of Chicago, because 23 million objects is just objects. That's not even all the stories we could be sharing. We also have a really robust student visiting and education program, and I also like to highlight for folks that we have a public research center that is free and open to the public. You don't need a reservation, and you can come see history for yourself through our research collections. So if anything today strikes you as interesting, please come visit. But that said, I'm going to share a little bit about the initiative. As I said, Chicago Sacred is a big title, and it could mean a lot of things to different people. So I'm going to start with this question that just says, what does it mean for something to be sacred? So if we have a whole initiative around this idea of sacredness, there's a lot of ways we could approach that topic. And so this is going to be a little bit about what sacredness means for me personally as a curator in a museum context and what I'm thinking about and how that might be different in the context we could explain it as a community or as a person of faith, but also maybe some similarities that we may not expect in a history or museum setting. So this is a set of guidances actually from an international body that talks about how we approach museum practice, and they have this great resource called Museology and the Sacred. And in it, it says something really interesting, which is sacredness, which is in and of itself something perhaps undefinable to us, is so directly linked with culture and heritage that they are kind of a mutually defined thing. And so when I use the word sacredness, I often think of something set apart. It's something separate from everyday life. It may not be something we all have the exact same definition for, but we recognize it when we see it together. And that is something very closely linked to those objects we put in museums that tell our history. There's something we've taken from an everyday setting and uplifted and said, this is something we collectively recognize and share in. In another form of cultural heritage term, what can be really challenging in museum settings is history can feel distinct or separate from what is our everyday lived lives. So if something comes in from the street and into our museum, sometimes people can think of that as separate now. And UNESCO has this really interesting way of talking about preserving history without making it static, without saying this is only something that lives in the past. And as public historians, this is really important to us because there's a connection between the history we share and care for with living communities today, and we want to ensure that they are not mutually separated. And so another term for this is something called living religious heritage. And for me, this means history is something that sometimes implies it's in the past, but we, every day, through our own bodies, through our own actions, thoughts, are embodying a living religious heritage too. And so it is the work of the museum to marry these things and to think about these things being in conversation with each other. When we talk about bringing objects into the collection, sometimes there's different ways we could think about sacredness within the object itself. And so I really love this resource that talks about these 3 models for things coming into the museum. And they may be things you've thought about, they may be new ways of thinking about something. But I think it's interesting for us to think about how a museum itself participates or sometimes prohibits the idea of something maintaining a sacred quality. And so the first definition, euthanized sacredness, comes exactly with what the word euthanize implies. It's the idea that once something comes through the threshold of the museum, it's no longer sacred. It's been, a new object identity as museum object, no longer sacred object. I think we see a lot of examples of that with historic artifacts where museums no longer see them as embodied sacred things. And that may not always be true for communities that encounter them. So that second definition that says in the beholder's eye is really something in which museums are not at a place where they're inviting participation with the sacredness, but it's also true that sometimes community members will come and see an object and think, I have a sacred connection to that object. And so while the museum is not necessarily telling you that this is sacred, for someone that recognizes it, they see it as sacred. The third definition, which is one I find really fun, is the zombie model. Zombie meaning something that gets activated and then goes quiet again. And this tends to be a lot of how museums use objects. We keep them in storage, we put them in a place where people don't see them, and then we bring them out on display and invite participation with them. I think an interesting thing to think about is there's a fourth definition that's not up here, which is what do we think about with objects that will be sacred all the time, both in storage and on display, and how are we treating relationship to those? So just some ways we could think about sacredness and the objects themselves within our museum. A couple of other quick things I'll share from some academic background, and then we'll go into examples from the museum. But the first thing is thinking about, okay, we have sacredness in museum context broadly, but we are here in the United States. We are in a city, Chicago, and those two settings create some really distinctive ways we can be thinking about sacredness in the context of what we just shared. One of those things is the idea that these materials that represent our everyday heritage together continue to create relationship and tell us about the country we live in. And this seems obvious sometimes, but it's not always been true for museum studies that people have treated American religion as something distinctive, and those that practice religions here in America as something that deserves the same representation as other forms of history. It is also true that religion in an urban setting is distinctive, and often when people have written about religious histories, religion in a city is treated as something kind of other or outsider or not fully representing what is American religion, which is usually through a lens of Christianity, Euro-American heritage, and saying this is equally important, the diverse and distinctive ways that religion is embodied in cities through many different communities and many different forms of faith. These are all important parts of what it means to have American religious heritage in city settings. And so this also helps inform then the places we find ourselves. So cities are like anywhere else in the world. We find ourselves in a space. We might find ourselves in a building like this, in a neighborhood like Irving Park. None of it is coincidental. We are all formed by the places we are in, and the places we are in are informed by us. There's a relationship between these things. And we could think of that as something like a religious geography or a spiritual geography. And in the city of Chicago, a lot of people don't think about how embedded the very neighborhoods we are and their connection to religious and spiritual places. So a small example is the idea that a parish has been used as the same term as a neighborhood for the city of Chicago, often being defined around a Catholic church. Those Catholic churches would often be organized around a national or ethnic identity or a language you spoke. This started to create neighborhood identities around the city that continued to inform how neighborhoods identified themselves through time, and as they changed through time, would then be another way of thinking about city identity or another way of thinking about community identity. And this actually even informs things we see around segregation and inequality, because if we have these organizations around identity, we also have to think about who's being excluded or not as lifted within these organizational structures. The last thing I'll say about that, relating to lack of representation or underrepresentation, is the idea that while museums sometimes participate in a process where we are divorcing sacredness from its everyday setting or the practice of people in certain contexts, it is also true that museums can be places of safeguarding. And I use that word to mean that something is coming in with an idea of care for the future. And often, things that come, let's say in our everyday life and our practice, things change through time and history can be lost. And so while the museum may not be a neutral setting, meaning we have our own legacies of inequality, we can be a setting in which things are preserved for the future. And that is something in terms of, I guess the word we use on the screen here is iconoclasm, but that idea of erasing history. So there's a tension between trying to honor sacredness and also participate as a place of remembrance or a place of keeping these things for the future. The last thing I'll say, just from a kind of theoretical standpoint for how we approach religion, in a museum setting, it is a very different and distinct thing than how you might approach religion as a sacred context or in a place of worship. And part of that is because, as I said, museums are not neutral, but we certainly have ways in which we want to be inclusive of how religion can be approached through a learning lens as well as a participant lens. And so for us, we follow Harvard's Divinity School's recommendations around principles of religious literacy. So the first is, when we talk about religion, we want to make sure religion is understood, that your personal expression or how you practice your faith is different and distinct from a scholarly study. And that's not to say one should be privileged over the other, but it's an understanding that there may be different ways of doing that. The second is that religions are internally diverse. So even if we were to talk about one singular tradition, like in a context of an exhibition or in a study, we should know that that doesn't mean it's representative of everybody that practices that. And so there's lots of diversity even within single traditions. Because we're working in a history setting, we also try to talk about that religion changes over time. And so if we're talking about something in 1893, that may not be how something is practiced or believed or phrased today. Could be, but it may not be. And so understanding that this change happens over time is really important for talking about history. And then the last is that really my favorite part of talking about religion, which is religion's everywhere. There are so many things that inform our everyday life that we don't understand as being, kind of capital R religion, and that this is something that we can get really excited about because it informs so much more than we may have realized. So going back to the work of Chicago Sacred now, I'm going to give a few examples of how we do this through the initiative at the museum, and then I'll give some examples of how we've done this in an interpretation setting in an exhibition. So one of the questions to think about is, if we have an initiative called Chicago Sacred, what makes Chicago a sacred city? Why would we call it a sacred city if we're going to do this work? A lot of people point to legacies of religious traditions being here in Chicago as part of that sacred legacy. And so I'm in a very good setting to be talking about the World's Columbian Exhibition of 1893. But our museum has a very large collection of materials from the World's Columbian Exhibition, as well as the Parliament of the World's Religions. And this was marked as one of the most important, most likely the first kind of interfaith gathering of its kind, in which leaders from many diverse religious traditions were brought together and talked about their faith. And of course, Swami Vivekananda's speeches being very informative to the legacy of religious tolerism and universalism in the city. And understanding these legacies helps us understand how people continue to connect with religious and spiritual traditions here in the city. And so I did have a quote from Swami Vivekananda, just talking about how things coming together in a form of universal understanding. And while we have many different expressions of religion, understanding that these all lead to a centered goal, whether we see that as a divine goal, but a way of coming together. So for us in the work of a museum, if we take a legacy like that and we understand there's this deep embedded connection to Chicago as a place for many diverse religious traditions, that is something we can tell through stories of things we find in our museum. And so I like to see that work as the materials we hold in the museum, whether they've been marked as sacred or not by us, are sacred through a kind of relationship we can build through those connections. And so one of the things we do is an inventory of our collections around different religious types. And this is a way of talking about different points of connection to materials that we may not have understood their full history, or we may not have had the full context for how they came into our collection. And that inventory allows us to then connect these to different communities or ideas around the city's history. Our first inventory was done around our Native American and Indigenous collections inventory. So we have my position as Curator of Religion and Community History, and we also have a collections fellow who works doing this inventory. And our first fellow focused on the Native peoples and Indigenous collections, which allowed us to create a really robust understanding of sacredness within the context of Indigenous collections, including things like our process for repatriation if needed and things like that. And we've now moved into our architecture collections, which I'll speak to a little bit more in the future, but another way of connecting places to these religious histories through the work of understanding our materials better. We also do oral history, so you've heard me shout out my colleague Peter Alter. He's the director of our Studs Terkel Oral History Center. But these oral histories are a way of capturing first-person perspectives about their life experiences through a lens of social justice, which means really creating equity around what's in our collection and the everyday lives of people. We have a number of digital resources, so we do digital exhibitions, we have online articles and ways of learning about materials, all accessible through our website. And then we also do something called community heritage workshops, which is an opportunity for us to share some tips and tricks we've learned as historians for how you can care for your own history for the future. And so while we absolutely take things in as a museum, we think it's equally important to empower people to preserve and share their own history. So going back to what I said about the work of the initiative, obviously we have these collections, and these are things, again, you can come, you can research your own history, you can learn about things, but then we also use them to interpret and do exhibition work. And so in creating my position at the museum and saying, okay, we have a robust reason to talk about religion all the time in the context of Chicago, there were 3 big exhibitions that were done. We called them the Abrahamic Suite, but it focused on the Abrahamic traditions. And the first was called Catholic Chicago, which was focused on Catholic histories. Second was Shalom Chicago, focused on Jewish traditions. And then the third was American Medina. I'll give Peter one more shout out. He was the lead curator on American Medina, which also it centered Muslim histories of the city. Really quickly, just to give a quick overview for why I think these matter so much. When we're talking about traditions, and I mentioned, we have these principles from Harvard Divinity School that talks about how we talk about a singular tradition. Traditions are very diverse internally. So even though these are each talking about one tradition, they had a lot of diverse perspectives about that tradition, both in practice and also how it's evolved through time and its place in the city has shifted through time. For Catholic Chicago, something I'd like to point out when we think about not just the way Catholicism evolved through time, but also how we interact with the idea of a sacred setting in the museum. This is a part of the exhibition that was there, and I think a lot of people, when they look at that space, it looks like a church chapel to them. It looks not that different from a place of worship. What's interesting is this is no one church chapel. All of these parts that you see are from different churches, and I guess we could use the phrase simulacra. It's a model. None of this would be something you see in the real world, and yet people would walk in and have a spiritual feeling when they walked into the space, or they might choose to sit on that pew and feel like they needed to have a moment. Some people would just walk in and see it as a museum space and keep walking. And so this really, to me, embodies that idea of the eye of the beholder. So we as a museum put up a thing that looked like a Catholic space, and it's your choice to see it as something sacred and religious, your choice to understand it as history. But either way, inviting the understanding that many diverse communities, even within the Catholic setting, could create this space together. For Shalom Chicago, what I really appreciate about this exhibition, again, this focused on Jewish histories, and it really focused on 2 main waves of migration for the Jewish community through time, one by German Jews and later by Eastern European Jews. And what I thought was really interesting about the curatorial approach to this was talking about not just how the faith is practiced or important people and histories, but how it was a part of everyday life in ways you may not expect. And so if you are familiar with Judaism, there's really specific ways of eating if you follow kosher food laws. And so it would have you sit and just think about, okay, where are the places I can eat if I'm going to have, a kosher meal? How far can I walk on Sabbath if I follow the prescription for distance and not doing work? And really thinking about how that informs then what you think about as your community. If you can't eat somewhere, is that your community? If you can't walk there, is that going to be your community? And so I really appreciated taking that everyday lens outside of just a religious belief. For American Medina, this was really rooted in Muslim oral histories of the city, which really rooted experience in diversity, as we were talking about. So it had a marriage of all the things you saw in Catholic Chicago and Shalom Chicago, in talking about places of worship and important figures, but it was also really grounded in these first-person perspectives. And I think there's almost 150 oral histories, if I remember correctly, which is a lot of voices. And so this also focused and took roots back in the World's Columbian Exhibition, which had some of the earliest purpose-built mosques in the country. and mapping out where these places affect geography of the city. Just a sample of the oral history, we'll keep going. So these exhibitions, like I said, they all focused on this idea of a singular tradition and trying to show diversity through time of how these traditions took place. And then when I started at the museum, there was this intention that we set to talk about what multi-faith representation could look like through our exhibition work. And when I say multi-faith, I mean we'll have multiple faith traditions represented, in this case, or in the case of the couple examples I'll show you, in the context of an ethnic or national identity. And so while there's points of connection through that ethnic or national identity, there's different expressions of how you connect to that based on your personal belief and background. And so those two exhibitions were back home Polish Chicago, which I guess one more shout out for Peter. I co-curated with Peter, or led with Peter Alter, and a community scholar and academic named Dominic Pizziga. And then a forthcoming exhibition we have about Latino stories of Chicago called Aquí in Chicago, which opens this coming fall. So for Back Home Polish Chicago, again, it focused on Polish histories of Chicago, and it was rooted in the experience of folks that have come through different waves of migration, again, leaving for different reasons, through different time periods, focused on their experience of coming through something called journeys, their experiences of being here, rooted in neighborhoods, and then their experiences of remaining connected to a home that might not be Chicago, and how you maintain connection to two places at one time. And so I'll give a couple of examples about spaces that I thought were interesting examples of how sacredness entered the conversation in multi-faith perspective. So the first is a Polish Catholic church that was called St. Mary Magdalene. This church has since closed and is now in use as a school. But there were a couple of artifacts in the exhibition that were actually new to me, or I should say one of them especially was new to me. And I'm not sure if they're familiar to anyone else in the room, but the artifact on the left that looks like 4 cups is a series of bells that you would ring in a Catholic service at specific moments of sacredness, usually around communion. So it would be a moment to mark the Spirit's presence entering. The artifact on the right is something called a clapper or a clacker. This is made of wood, and so when you move it, it doesn't have the sharp ring of a bell. It has a very dull sound, and they would use that only during the week of Holy Week, which is a very somber time in the Christian tradition, which is in the period of Lent, where people are fasting and counting down to Jesus' resurrection. This is leading up to his time of death, and so bells are too cheery. You can't ring a bell, it sounds too happy, and so you use this clapper instead because of its dull sound. What I really appreciated about this is, for me, these are just 2 museum objects that we were looking at in a context with other museum professionals, and somebody who had grown up going to St. Magdalene's Church came over to the table and picked it up and said, "This is how the clapper worked. I used to do this when I was a kid." And if you think about that model we were talking about, where sometimes we remove that sacredness, or we, as museum professionals, treat things kind of distant, she absolutely, embodied that zombie model. This thing is alive and active, and she's a kid again in her church home. And I think about the power it means to maintain an object, even in a closed church, for creating that continuity to a sacred tradition. Another example was a community that was on the Jewish side of Polish history called B'nai Shalom, and they are a legacy congregation that today is part of the KAM Isaiah Israel congregation. And with them, we had this opportunity to talk about their evolution and change through time by visiting spaces together and talk about how their community has shifted and how the spaces themselves are still around, but they are all in new use and new purpose today, mostly by Christian churches. And that was a really great way to bridge this topic of how we talk about evolution and change of traditions through time. And then finally, an example that kind of bridges it to our next exhibition, which is Aquí in Chicago. St. Adalbert's is a church that was also a Polish Catholic church that had actually been tried, the Archdiocese had tried to close the church several decades ago, and there had been a really valiant effort by congregation members to keep the doors open, and it remained open up until just a handful of years ago. And through time, these Polish communities also became Latino majority, and so it shows how the evolution of the neighborhood also shows different points of connection to the same spaces. And so while the church has closed now, it has been landmarked and it is going to be repurposed, but it also shows how these points of connection through different identities are embodied in one faith tradition. And when we think about Aquí in Chicago, this is focused on Latino stories. The origins for this exhibition are actually one that's very interesting for us as museum folk. There was a group of high school students from Rudy Lozano Leadership Academy who came to the museum to look for, a tour of the history of Chicago, and they wanted to learn about where their place in history was. And when they came, they didn't see it in our main exhibition. They didn't see themselves represented. We did not do a good job having Latino stories in the primary stories of what makes Chicago today. And so they protested the museum, and they said, we'd like to see ourselves, and it's your job as museum people to fix that. And so since 2021, my colleague Elena Gonzalez has been leading the effort to not just have an exhibition, but to also systematically think about how we introduce Latino stories, which represent a third of the city in population, into our museum in a more holistic way. This also has several stories about place and religious traditions and change through time. So the two churches represented on the left, St. Francis and St. Procopius, these are both Catholic churches that were built for European Catholics when they came. And through time, again, went into disrepair, and it was really Latino communities that started to give new life to these spaces, and sometimes having to literally occupy buildings that were going to be demolished in order to keep their places of worship open. And so these stories of resistance and talking about what it means to maintain a place and point of connection. And then the church on the right is Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the first Mexican church in the city that was built by and for Spanish-speaking congregations. And this is also a conversation around how you make space and place for yourself in the city. Also in the story are a lot of, or I should say in the exhibition, are a lot of stories around how people come and migrate here and the status of Chicago being seen as a sanctuary city, especially for undocumented people. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink. And we talk about the ways in which places of worship have served as both a literal sanctuary, as in a place for spiritual refuge, but also a physical sanctuary for people that were looking for support against deportation. And so there's two main waves of the sanctuary movement we talk about. The first wave began in the 1980s, and so places like Wellington UCC Church, and again, KAM Isaiah Israel are two important places for that. And the new sanctuary movement with Adalberto UMC and Lincoln UMC, which was in the early 2000s. And then we also talk about how within the context of Christian practice, especially in Latino communities, there's a tension between Catholicism and indigenous practice. And so for some people, Catholicism was seen as a way of erasing their identity. And for some people, they found a way to hybridize or put those identities in kind of conversation with each other within their own life. And so we talk about the ways people do that through preserving language. So having Spanish as a language that is not your first language, but is actually your third language because you speak indigenous languages that, hold sacred meaning and have whole worlds within them, or through food traditions. So the idea that corn or maize is something that is a sacred food, and so maintaining that and continuing to make things like tortillas here in Chicago is a way of asserting that. And then a more kind of bridging conversation, but leading into a digital exhibition that we recently did. Gosh, Peter, you get so many shout outs today. Also with Peter Alter, our chief historian and director of the Studs Terkel Oral History Center. So Peter has also been collaborating with Chicago Theological Seminary around capturing histories of really Operation Breadbasket, which is Jesse Jackson and kind of various circles of Martin Luther King Jr. And stories. And that included oral history traditions. It included this virtual exhibition, like I mentioned, and it has some connections to this place as well, which we'll get to in a minute. But Reverend Martin Deppy and Reverend Janet Wilson are both two folks that have been ordained in the Methodist system that we'll talk about. So now having seen some of the work that we are doing and have done, what our next challenge is, or I guess what I'm trying to make our next challenge, is to think how we move beyond what a multi-faith representation is into a truly interfaith representation. And so if I think about what does it mean to have an interfaith space in today, here in Chicago, what does that mean, and why is that different than the things we've been talking about so far? And so one of the things I want to highlight within this context is we are in a period of religious change in the United States. We're in a period of religious change around the world, absolutely, but it looks different in different places. And so in the United States, a lot of times when we're talking about what religion in America is, a lot of it is focused on decline. A lot of it is focused on mainstream Christian denominations not having as many people sit in a pew as they once did. And what does that mean for religion? Other things we will see is a lot of things talking about contested space. And I use the word contested space, meaning when new people come to spaces that maybe we're not used to seeing that representation, that form of practice, that form of faith, we see a lot of public scrutiny around that coming. And what's really interesting is when people are talking about decline, I feel like they're not focusing on what I consider to be where our area and focus should be. And that is, when we say religious change, we're not just talking about decline, we're talking about change. And so one of the things a lot of folks are paying attention to is the idea that people might be moving from these mainline Christian traditions toward a representation of something we might call spiritual but not religious. Sometimes they use the phrase religious nuns, which just means, nothing specific, but maybe a little bit of everything, or maybe something that resonates with me, but doesn't resonate with a specific mainline tradition. And so these projections by Pew Research are looking forward to 2070, and you see a line that's declining, and that is, that is absolutely, Christianity and some projections around Christianity. And then a line that's rising right above it is this projected idea around religious nuns, which is to say people are going to keep gravitating towards form of religious practice, but may just look different than it once did. And then the line at the bottom that I think is often lost in the conversation is non-Christian traditions. So non-Christian traditions are expected to double in the United States by 2070, which means 6% of the population may today be practicing a non-Christian tradition, but that's going to be 12 or 13%. And if that's true, then again, how are we talking about sacred space and our interactions with sacred space with and for each other? I'm going to talk just very briefly about the context I do this work in. This is based on personal research I've been doing for a number of years, but just to kind of give a brief background to when I say interfaith space, and I'm talking about this in a history and heritage lens, what I mean. And so I think they said this in my introduction, but a number of years ago I started something called Sacred Shift. And what that looks at is if one place doesn't change in terms of walls, or may not change in terms of cities, but we think about this layering of history and use and communities through time. What does that mean for our own definitions of what sacredness is in that space, and the ways that we might connect to each other as an interfaith place of heritage? So not just a place that has layers, but a place that has interaction. And I think that's a really different way of talking about change through time than we often see it. These are places of connection and interaction, not just change. And I think that affords us a really, really promising opportunity if we choose to look at it that way. I will acknowledge, though, that puts some things in tension. And so these are a couple of kind of heritage terms, but ones that we often use is, you have a built space and you have this living religious heritage. Sometimes the built space is not always reflective of the living heritage using the space. We have these tangible things like walls and windows and pews, and we have these intangible things like prayers and music and food. We also have these things we see as secular, like you could do a baseball game outside, you could have a concert in here, and we also have these sacred things. That concert could be seen as a sacred concert if it's the right music. Who decides which is which? It's a really interesting tension. I see these tensions all the time when we think about traditions that change different communities but are maintained within the same tradition. So as I was saying, you might have a Christian church that is used by a different Christian congregation, but they might have different backgrounds, and so those tensions are still real and there. But these tensions seem to be especially true in places where things change through different religious traditions through time. And again, I'm interested in how we can shift that narrative from being just about the tensions of change into a productive opportunity for discussion around what interfaith heritage is. And so for me, this really calls to question whatever authentic heritage is. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with the landmarking process, but a lot of times when we talk about what heritage or history is, we go back to something that's the original purpose something was made, and we don't think about all the ways it might have historic importance through time. And this really puts a lot of tension into that multi versus inter. So I said, multi-faith or multiculturalism is just saying all these things are represented at one time. Interfaith and interculturalism is really about the dialogue, right? It's really about how we're intentionally engaging with each other about this. And so, going back to that tangible and intangible, that can also be memory and erasure, right? It is the choice to remember these things together and hold them together, or it is the choice to decide some of these things are worth remembering and some aren't. And that's something we collectively do as public historians all the time. It is our job to help people remember for the future, and we can't do that alone or we won't remember it all. And so I think that's really important for the work that we're doing. So going back to what we talk about just with the idea of what it means to be an interfaith city, then we have to think about, okay, we're doing this in a museum. It's nice to be in a space like this where maybe we think about interfaith things on a regular basis. We don't always do that in the museum. So how do we make a museum gallery engage in these topics? Especially when we think about some of the ways we may have done that in the past, how do we move that going forward? So I mentioned before, we've shifted our focus of the inventory for Chicago Sacred to our architecture collections. And the architecture collections are a legacy collection we've had for a number of decades at the museum since the 1970s. And the idea that the architecture collections were built as something that wasn't meant to just celebrate design, it wasn't meant to just celebrate beautiful buildings, but it was also to talk about people. And so what I really like about our collections is from the start, there was this idea that buildings don't just happen in a vacuum. People make them, people design them, and people use them. And we need to talk about all of those things to really have the idea of what a building or architecture is for. And so this is an important collection we have in the museum by Holabird and Roche and Holabird and Root. But the curator at the time, Wim DeWitt, wrote this nice thing that talks about what the built environment is. And he says, it's all these elements together that make the built environment, not just the built things that we see. And really what I think that means is we're talking about placemaking, right? We're talking about the idea that these places don't matter if we're not here to enjoy them together. These places will just be places without each other. And so, shifting that focus into the people that use buildings are just as important, if not more important, than why the buildings are there. In the context of the exhibition we're working toward now, I'm thinking about this a lot in terms of representation, not just in our museum collections, but also what the city has valued in terms of landmarking and saying this is our collective history and heritage by making specific places, on these lists of national importance. And I say that again, reminding us when I talked about when we discuss American religious tradition, and when people talk about what religion means in America, it often biases and looks to Protestant especially, but Christian definitely, traditions, places, and representation. And a lot of that is based on what I think is a misunderstanding of all the points of connection these places have through time and all the ways that communities have made space through time. And so it's interesting to think about how that connects to specific places in the city that might not be histories represented on a landmark list, but if I can make my own landmark list, I would say there's a lot of places that still need uplifting. And so I'll give a brief example, but I mentioned before we had the Jackson Oral History Project, which looked at histories around Operation Breadbasket. Reverend Deppie was pastor at this church called Gresham UMC, later New Gresham United Methodist Church, so it's a similar Christian tradition as this building, and this building has actually closed recently, and so it's a history and a legacy that lives in the oral histories and in people's stories, but we don't know if it will continue to live in the building that's still there. As I mentioned with Aki in Chicago, there are some important places that were a part of the sanctuary movement and citywide protections for undocumented peoples. And the church on the left, Adalberto UMC, was just a storefront church in the Humboldt Park neighborhood. That has also been closed, and that storefront is repurposed as an artist space now. And so, again, it might be a landmark that people don't recognize 10 years from now, unless we tell the stories and remind people this is a place these things happened. So when we're doing that through an architecture inventory, I don't know if you remember the number I said, but we have 23 million objects in our collection. Architecture collections are probably in the hundreds of thousands. So it's very hard to think about how we can approach this systematically, but a way we're trying to do that is not just through documenting who an architect was, but we are documenting the communities that have used those spaces based on places in the city, based on address, IDs, different racial and ethnic connections, different community organizations. And so it's a very slow and methodical research project, not just an inventory to say we have something and check a box. And our purpose for doing that is really so that the public has full understanding of all of the ways that there is representation in our existing collections. And I'll give an example from a partnered institution, American Islamic College. We have works by an important architect called Barry Byrne, and there's a landmarked building that he built that was built as a Catholic school and convent. And in all of our metadata, meaning the terminology we use to describe this space as the museum, it only talks about it as a Catholic school and church. But what we don't have in our metadata is that this has been used by American Islamic College since the 1980s, which means it actually has been used as an Islamic college longer than it was ever used by the Catholic Church, which is really interesting in terms of identity. I think most people today would know it more as American Islamic College than they would as Immaculata High School. And so for us, it is an act of repair and is also an act of careful research to make sure that we are representing all these points of connection, even just in the language we're using to describe something, because that allows different people to understand the collections we have and in new ways. Because otherwise, if you were looking for American Islamic College in our collections, the only photo we had identified was this very nice photo. It's a portrait of men in their prayer space, but you would have no indication of where that was. You wouldn't know that this was actually something we have represented multiple times. So I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to thank Swami Ashidmananda and Sarvani again for the lovely tour you gave us at Homer Glen, because there were some beautiful panels that you shared with us that had different points of connection for Swami Vivekananda while he was here in the city, and then your community through time. And I remembered from that conversation, you asked, hey, are there more photos of these places? And Peter and I started to look, and I said, actually, we have most of these places multiple times. And I would have never known the points of connection your community has to these spaces, if you weren't so kind to share that with me. And so there's certainly some better metadata work we can do. And these are just 3 examples, but there's hundreds of places like this, I imagine, that are places of connection that we didn't know that you would have in our collections. I will say I was excited to find some things that actually are labeled. I will say there's probably metadata work to do, but there were some photos, at least of the Hyde Park location that were correctly identified. So I thought I would share these just as a point of connection. Kind of fun, but I noticed in the photo on the left and right there, you can see construction for the addition that was put in front of the house. So they happened to catch it, I guess, at a moment of transition even there. And then we do have a few photos of things that were happening inside. So I remembered talking about Christmas celebrations and Ravi Shankar, of course, having many concerts, it looked like, but at least a sample of a concert there, and some things like that. And then also just to highlight, there are these fantastic photos that were taken, but the way that folks represent these photos or the way that they've been described give us no context for how important these people are or even specific names of who they are. And so, again, this is the repair work of the museum saying we have these things, but they're only as good as we have them and who's in them. And so, that's the ongoing work of the inventory. And I loved that there was actually a quote from Swami Vivekananda that I could find about architecture that I thought just nailed this point home. But he says, the difference between architecture and a building is that the former expresses an idea, while the latter is merely a structure built on economic principles. The value of matter depends solely on its capacities of expressing ideas. And to me, that's exactly what we're talking about here, where ideas, the people, the community, the shared understanding is really what makes a space a space. And so I will end with just a little discussion around this building, and then we will move into questions. But again, this space is a space of connection like that, and it really is very auspicious feeling for the invitation to get to speak here about this topic, because this is a really powerful center, and the work that's being done here is a powerful example of that. And so I will say, again, I want to thank David Foster and Vicki Rogers for taking the time to share some things with me about the history of this space. But this is a point of shared history too, and so it was built as First Methodist of Irving Park, and actually there's a photo on the left that's of a previous iteration of the building before this building, and it served as a place of healing and prayer for the Methodist Church. And then, a couple iterations later on the right, that looks a little more like what we see on the outside today. I thought this was a great juxtaposition of the inside, getting to see this is what it looked like at a commemorative service that they had in the 1960s, and seeing again the power of having a place of contemplation and prayer and gathering still in use. I especially loved some of the points of connection with upstairs. And so, the third story is now this beautiful world religions course, place of contemplation again, place of learning, and learning from Vicki and from David that the third story here has had a long history of being a place of connection and a place of kind of recreating and rethinking oneself. And so, that's included things like ministry for incarcerated peoples as they were re-entering. That's included a place of reconciliation for LGBTQ folks, thinking about how they are considered within a sacred context in their tradition. And so, finding these points of connection, even with physical changes that might, have shifted over time, thinking about how these spaces continue to embody some shared principles is really powerful, I think. And this was a flyer, great couple flyers they sent me, but the way that communities continue to reach out through sharing food, like we'll do soon downstairs, and the community food pantry that was here for a long time, or thinking about how we even communicate and celebrate our history through time, and the importance of coming together and marking those moments, like this 125-year flyer does. So just to thank you again for the invitation to talk about this, in this beautiful space that you have done such a beautiful job activating and creating community within. And again, Chicago Sacred as the initiative of the museum. And that's me, so in case anyone needs to find me later. But I'll open it up for questions. Okay.
So when I traveled with the Swami, I saw something similar in South Africa. I saw something in Ireland, in Singapore. I always wondered what we had here. So thank you, Peter, thank you. One, when you come across a theme, right? When you come across a congregation, how do you decide on the tangible versus intangible? How do you pick up the sacred versus not sacred? Yeah. So how do you do about it? Second is, what is your criteria to pick? There is so much, is it not? So how do you pick a congregation? How do you pick a community? So those are some of the basic questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Those are two very good questions. They're two very big questions too. So I will do my best. And I will also say, I am one person, I work in a team, and we work within a big context of a museum. So we have some autonomy to think about these things. We also have some confines to think about these things. I'll think first about your question about how we decide tangible and intangible, or how we define those things for a community or with the community, which is really more how I think about it. So a couple of things I'll say. In heritage studies as a practice, a big part of it is about listening. So it's not coming in and saying, okay, I know what's important in this room. It's saying, tell me what you see as important. And that's why I think for me, a lot of times, I came from a more traditional art history and architectural history background first. And historians tend to be so focused on what you see and not as focused on what you experience or what the dialogue and the conversation and the practice is, that it really didn't sit well with me. And so I try to at least hold those things in balance. That being said, having that title of curator implies I'm supposed to have some kind of judgment about it. I guess in the way that a religious leader would have some kind of line they draw around practice that might be different than, let's say, you individually might pray differently, and that might just be what works for you. And that actually is probably the hardest part of the job, is sometimes saying, okay, the historical documentation doesn't quite align with what you just told me. Is it my job to decide that's wrong or not? And just sitting there with that, right? So, if somebody says, no, this is how I pray, I don't care what that textbook says, I'd probably just go with what they said then, because, especially in the context of public history, we're trying to do this together, and it's not my job to prove what your practice is, it's to help celebrate it. So I think that's how I try to approach it. You might get a different answer from Peter or anyone else, but, that's my way. Your second question is such a good one, because even for me, being at the museum for 3 years, I feel like I would have answered that differently 2 years ago than I do now. Part of it is through relationships, right? And so I think a lot of it becomes kind of a grassroots, hey, have you talked to so-and-so? Hey, did you know about this? And sometimes you see a momentum building, where you see, okay, this is the time to talk about this thing. I'll give an example of that with like a key in Chicago. Getting protested by high schoolers is a really good momentum builder, where it was like, okay, it's time to be talking about Latino identity because we need to address this. I think what the project we're working on now brings is a new challenge, in that we're trying to talk about not just one community, but to think about this as a phenomenon of sacredness in the city overall, and kind of through individual stories. And so for me, I think going back to my idea of like how we build relationship, it's really been about who feels like they want to take this moment to share, or who we feel like they trust us with that story. And I think trust is really important in moving forward. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. A lot of good information here, so thank you very much. My question is about museums in general. I have not been to the Chicago History Museum, but it's going to be on my list this year for sure. I have seen it from outside. How do museums actually help bring the communities together in general, right? Like, it could be education for sure, but then well-being, or community, some positivity, bringing some positivity in the communities. How does that work overall, especially from the history perspective?
Wow, you guys are really good with questions. Yeah, I mean, again, different museums have different approaches. So if I were working in an art institution, I might think differently than how I feel working in public history. To your point, education has been a tool that the museum has tried to use, where that might be programming, that might be a panel, it might be, working with elementary school students. So I do think that education as a tool for teaching history, social justice, your own story path, is one we use. When we do exhibitions like the ones that I was uplifting, man, I'm thinking through all the ways that, phone calls, lunches, site visits, everything we can. I think for a key in Chicago, we have a panel that has 500 names on it of people that we just want to thank, saying, you helped us make this happen. And, there are milestones we might, as curators, try to build into that process and say, okay, here's a lunch we're all going to have as a group. Here's a meeting you can come to. Here's, a celebration you can come to, a workshop. But there's no way we could actually do all of that without people just organically creating their own supports and interest. And so I think we can only take credit for a very little bit of that, actually, because a lot of it is people taking ownership and wanting to do it. So going back to building trust, I think we have tools, but if nobody showed up, then nothing was done as a curator, right? And so, yeah, I think there are ways, close research, all the work you have to do as a historian, but creating an atmosphere people want to be a part of is probably the biggest thing.
Hi, my question is about your collecting philosophy. So I'll just use some of the examples that you showed today. For example, you have, and I'm Catholic and I'm Polish Catholic. So you had the example of St. Mary Magdalene, where you had these two objects and then the picture of the church. St. Mary Magdalene historically is not one of the most important Catholic churches in Chicago by any stretch of the imagination. There are many other churches that were important both architecturally, culturally, historically, and so forth that represent Chicago. And one of them you had a picture of, St. Adalbert's. Now, some of those are still in operation, so obviously there wouldn't be materials available from them, but as you point out, St. Adalbert's is closed, St. Michael in South Shore is closed, so some of the most significant Polish churches have closed. Have you considered instead of coming across objects that perhaps come to you, being more aggressive in your collecting philosophy, so that you said to yourself, okay, the Polish community is most well represented by these things, and we should try to go out and aggressively seek artifacts and documents and so forth that represent these most important cultural and religious and architectural aspects of that community?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, especially when we say, collection inventory is part of the work. I think there's a few things. We could talk for a very long time about museums and their position right now compared to, as I was saying, churches in decline. One, I think there is an interesting framework I try to work in that we talk through the lens of heritage futures. And so the good and bad of being in public history is we are always having to say, why did you take that grandma's photo and not that grandma's photo? We're not necessarily taking Michelangelo's, which people kind of just acknowledge, okay, Michelangelo had something going on. It makes sense to me why you're collecting him or Picasso. So one, the idea that we as the institution just taking something, I mark as a sacred process, because it is saying, for some reason we decided that grandma and not that grandma, and I may not know why actually. And so I think for me, that is the power of doing an inventory of understanding what we already have, because it means there are things we've already decided have significance, and sometimes a very disproportionate significance to what actually exists in the world. So that's important for understanding. The other thing is just the practicalities of how you best work at the rate in which things like churches are closing. And so that is a particular framework we're working in right now, because historically Christianity has been very represented in Chicago history. So it means in our own collections, even if we're not capturing all of the change right now, it's still the majority of the religious traditions we have represented. And so we have to consider that when we have finite resources in space. Is this the moment we decide to aggressively think about, closing churches? Is this the moment we're thinking about how important it is to talk about religious change and new communities that are here? And how do we do both at the same time? Which is, always impossible when you can't. I mean, if anyone wants to help us with the finite resource end, maybe we address this differently, but it's a challenge. And so, part of that tool for me is talking about, just because something doesn't come into our specific museum's collection does not mean we can't be advocates and allies in how you care for that for the future. It also doesn't mean that it is only my place to decide which communities will be represented in the collection. And so, the idea of how do we think about Polish churches as an example? The Archdiocese has its way, and they are in the position to have an archive that does help kind of create some boundaries around what they're interested in. But there's also a lot of religious traditions that don't even have a central archive. And so those materials are even more vulnerable to not being preserved for the future, which means those are stories in history that we may not know if we don't actively think about it. And so I can think of a lot of congregations that have been in transitional moments that reach out. And right now, I will say we're more responsive than active because of the amount of materials that we're already being approached with. But it is interesting to think about how we build capacity, not just with us as an institution, but even citywide, to think about how we're caring for this together. And so I usually use the word ecosystem. Like, we are one part of an ecosystem of caring about religious heritage. And so that might be archives, that might be our collections. It's also embodied practice, right? It's also caring about people who physically do practice religious traditions or have sacred ways that they engage in the world or make a recipe. All of that is part of the same ecosystem.
A few people here know that this was my church. This is where I came when I first came to Chicago. I walked in single. I was married here. My children grew up here. And then I was a part of watching the church be turned over to the new owners and in the new home of Harmony. So for me, coming back in here is part of what you were really talking about. Is I see my children running through the aisles, and where did Cole hide, and where, what happened here in this space, and when did the food pantry people, when it was too cold, fill every single pew so that they could stay warm, so they could get their holiday meals and that. So there's so many stories here, and I think that the work that you're doing, from my perspective, is so important as far as sacred spaces. And is that a sacred space just because that was my church then? Or is that a sacred space because those doors are still open to me, and that there's still good work and love happening in that space? So we have a new space, but this is still, in my mind, a sacred space where I can come and feel welcome and tell my stories and share. And I think we as a country, in addition to we as a city and as a world, we need this more than ever right now, is that we are actually opening our doors instead of feeling that the door is closed. So I admire the work you're doing. I love the fact that this is still open to me here in the neighborhood, and I'm excited about the future. So when it comes to spaces like this, with Martin Deppy's history here and his history within the city and the civil rights movement, and he was a pastor here, well, there are connections that are really, really important. And I think those stories do need to be, brought up again and again as we create our new versions of those stories. But we still have many of these people who are here part of our communities, and we need to learn from them. And they will help us get through these difficult times. But we do need these sacred places. And we need to know that we are all welcome in those sacred places. So, thank you for this.
Rebekah?
So it was wonderful to listen to her, and I was wondering how she will represent the religion through a museum. When she first came and I met her, I was wondering how. So I was interested to listen to her talk. But here, when I saw the way she represented and presented to us how the history has been kept, particularly a religious history, in the museum, I'm really very much interested to visit that museum, and I will ask my friends to also to visit over there to learn. You know, friends, for millions of years, the human being are trying to find out peace, joy, happiness. That is the only thing they want. And they started their life in different places in this world and different weather and all that. So the features are different, languages are different, approaches are different, and we call culture a difference. But they all are going to the same goal. And the goal is called happiness. That happiness has been given as a name, the God, Jehovah, Allah, or Buddha, or Bhagavan, but it is all happiness. If we don't get happiness in heaven, I don't think nobody will think of going to heaven. So it is the happiness that we like to go. And on the way, when we are all developing and trying to reach over there, it is the social and the economical, political, different changes coming at different times. But we are going on proceeding. Science helped us a lot. The researchers, the science, they gave us a wonderful lifestyle. Now, the Swami Vivekananda, who traveled 2 months to reach America, now we go within 22 hours to India from here. That too we are not very happy. So we are thinking, so why not it make it 10 hours or 12 hours? It must be faster. So this is the way the life is proceeding, and every different comforts we are getting, but still our search for the happiness. So when you talk about a church, when you talk about a mosque, when you talk about a temple, a synagogue, it is nothing but giving us some ideas to reach to that happiness. And they develop different type of practices, different type of instruments, and it is the history that they collect, that they keep in the museum, and they show how the human are slowly proceeding towards that happiness. And thank you very much for the wonderful talk that you have presented. Actually, this church, when we purchased, I told, we are not going to change anything. This church is yours. I could feel the pain when they were going out. I told, it is not that you are going out. You are always welcome over here. Our idea, we are Hindu, but our idea, this Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna, as he practiced in his own life, he realized in his own life that all paths are leading to the same goal. So that is a unique conception. Suppose I like to go to as I always give the example, I like to go to Washington, D.C. I can take a train, I can go by car, I can fly. There are different paths, and no problem. Whoever can afford and whoever can choose, they can take that. But when people say, no, you have to go by road only, because I travel by road, and if you take another mode, I am going to fight with you and I am going to kill you. That is the problem. That is the narrowness that keeps us all the time in tension. This narrowness comes through politics also. So the religion always is nothing but love, and it generates from a person who practiced love, like the Jesus Christ. He practiced love. And in so much so that at the end, when the people, they were torturing him, nailing him alive, he was praying for them. So much love that he could not think that, oh, I should curse them. He could not think of that. So that was the love embodiment. What we learned from Lord Jesus, love. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And he says that you have to develop that love. In our religion also it says, Amrit. Amrit means that satisfaction, but through love. Friends, this is a home of harmony. So you're all very much welcome. I just met that lady, and she grew up in this locality, and this is his church. And she says, this watch, no, I said this is your church. So you can always come and pray in the way you like. And if we can reach out to this locality, the neighbors, if they can come, we can sit here together, we can discuss together, we can pray together. I will pray in a Hindu way. You pray in a church, Christian way, no problem at all. In the same place, sitting side by side. And we like to show to the world that we can reach to our heaven, though we in a different process, but sitting side by side, we can reach to that place. That will be the ultimate humanity. And I think the museum will record that someday. Thank you very much. Thank you.